Hey guys, welcome back to Not One Videos. I am out in the countryside, but I didn't bring any XPS foam with me. But thankfully, my father-in-law did have some of this insulation PIR foam. You can't cut it with a hot wire cutter, it's going to have to be carved. But I thought, maybe I can use this to build some terrain, and I've been wanting to build a cave. And what I'm thinking is to have a cave with a liftable top, so it's going to be a playable top terrain and then liftable and playable internal terrain as well. So let's give it a try. Okay, let's get started. PIR foam here in the UK comes wrapped in this foil and brown paper backing, which fortunately is very easy to remove. I was expecting it to be stuck all over the place like when you try and peel foam core and it goes wrong, but thankfully it all comes off super easily and I didn't have to use too much time to execute this initial stage of the build. I'm not a fan of tedious jobs that take too long. So there's nothing fancy about the methodology. I just started carving into the foam with a kitchen knife, gradually hacking it down into the rough shape that I had for my final terrain. This is a tip that I picked up from Joe Levine over at Encounter Terrain YouTube channel. Once I was satisfied with the shape, I carved a lip around the edge of the top piece so that when I stack it, the piece will slot down into the base snugly. I was careful to make the cut as evenly as possible the whole way around the edge. Once that was complete, I drew a line around the top of the terrain so that I had a good guide to start to dig out my cave. I moved the edge of the cave about 10 centimeters in front of the edge of that line so that I was sure not to have any gaps. Again, digging out the cave isn't pretty, but it is easy and effective. This whole process to get to this point took about 15 minutes or so. I then placed the top back onto the piece and figured out exactly where I wanted my cave to go. And again, just carved out my shapes with the knife, making sure to carve some away from the top piece as well, so as to make a more natural looking cave entrance. And there we go, that's the first stage of the build done. Now that I had my basic structure in order, I moved on to more detailed carving, creating some ledges and crags moving up the side of the piece so that minis can move easily when it comes to gaming. And then I carved some old ruined stairs into the top of the piece. This diorama was mostly intended to be an experiment into using PIR foam for terrain building, so I didn't have a specific story or scene in mind, but as always, The Lord of the Rings is somewhat influencing the aesthetic of this build. As you can see here, I carved up some bricks from the PIR foam to create my ruins. A few weeks ago my friend Carl did a video about bending XPS foam, which I considered doing, but in the end I thought the curve was too great, so bricks was the easiest way forward. Now here is another great pro to using PIR foam, and that is super glue does not melt the foam. Very useful indeed. Once all my bricks were glued and secure, I moved on to making some natural looking rock formations, and for this I used this chunk of cork bark. This was in my stocking on Christmas morning, and it's actually preheated for fungus, etc. to be used in reptile terrariums. One of the cool things that I found this week was a twig that had roots still attached to it. So I'm going to brick this in somehow. Maybe it's going to be an uprooted tree, but maybe it's going to be a tree that is actually rooted on somehow and the roots are still coming out. But I'm going to paint it all up and it's going to look awesome. So at this point in the video I'm going to cut from the build for a few minutes just to take you into the forest and show you some of my visual references that I've been using for this build. So this is one of my favourite trees in the Forest of Dean, and all of the roots are exposed and it's just coming out, and that's kind of what I'm going for in my little diorama today. There's another little one that's on top of a rock, which is exactly what I'm doing in my diorama, so we're just going to quickly take a look at that as well. I just wanted to show you my visual references. Awesome. Whoop. Awesome. So yeah, this is a small tree, but you can see the way the roots have clung to the rock and it's managed to take purchase. It's just totally amazing. Sorry for the shaky footage, but this is happening on a phone. But yeah, more visual references for the piece that I'm working on. Okay, so now that you guys can see the kind of thing that I'm aiming for with the visual references of those trees and the lovely exposed roots, I can get back to gluing this little tree together. So the reason I'm not doing my normal process and doing string with hot glue, etc., is because, yeah, obviously I found these lovely little roots on the end of this tree and I just wanted to utilize that inside the build, and to be quite honest, it worked perfectly. Okay, so I've got my big tree, and I think the perfect place for it is right on this boulder protrusion that I've created, and I want it to be leaning off to the side, poking up out over the cliff. And yeah, I'm just going to stick it. The roots are going to make it a little awkward to paint in around the stonework, but I'm sure I'll be able to work in around there somehow and sort all of that out. With the tree glued in place, I was able to start gluing down some smaller pieces of bark for boulders, and then as usual I moved on to covering the project with glue for my final bark flocking. Normally I would do this with PVA glue, but unfortunately I left that back in London, so I ended up using wood glue, which does pretty much the same thing, but unfortunately it just takes a little bit longer to dry. Okay, so as you can see, I've got a little line. It's pretty much possible to get this line to disappear completely with something like this. There's two ways I could do it. I could disguise it with, you know, foliage and different things, which is I'm probably going to partially do. But another thing that I am going to do is I'm going to cut other lines around this way in the rock. I'm going to include some photos right now on the screen of the kind of lines in rock that I mean. Like there's lots of crevices and stuff like that there, so kind of blend it a little bit more so that it's less noticeable that this has got one big line going around the edge. Woohoo! Finally an opportunity to whip out my little wood carving knife. I absolutely love using this thing. Okay, I keep stumbling across really cool little accidents here. Maybe loads of people have done these things before, I'm not sure. Maybe I'm regurgitating some other people's stuff, I don't know, but I've just been trying to brush the dust off, and this stuff is so fine that it's scoring little lines as well, and it looks awesome. In fact, I'm going to give you a quick close-up. Okay, so can you see these little lines? That looks so good, and that's just done with whenever I was trying to brush up the dust. So yeah, there's another trick for the trick bag, I suppose, and I'm going to actually go around the whole thing really roughly now and try and exaggerate that. Bing! This is awesome. I am loving this. Honestly, I love accidents that become awesome. I'm now starting to think this piece of terrain is going to look really, really good. I was starting to lose faith in it at the beginning. It wasn't a very good idea. But maybe now we'll see how we get on. So there's a lot of dust still left on there. I'm going to have to vacuum it up. But oh my. I'm actually going to get a rougher brush and see if I can go deeper. Okay, I'm all excited now because of this line technique. So I've gone and I've got on a floor brush, which has got an even bristlier bristle, and we're going to try and get these lines to go a bit deeper. And yes, it's working! Oh. So this technique is similar to a wire brush on XPS foam for wood, but wait till you see this rock texture, it's awesome. There we go, guys. That is the rock texture after carving out with a knife and brushing it, and I am extremely happy with that texture. I think it just looks awesome. It looks like lots of rock mountain formations that I've seen. This wasn't actually what I was originally going for, but whenever I saw this line thing happening, I was just like, okay, well, let's just go for that. And I think it looks really, really good. So Yeah, the thing about this kind of foam is that it is less dense than XPS foam. So yeah, 100% this has got to have a black Mod Podge base coat to strengthen up all those little edges. But when this gets painted up, it's going to look awesome, and I'm going to start right now. Okay, so I'm on to the black Mod Podge stage as usual, but I only brought with me one little tub this size of black Mod Podge. I wasn't expecting it to be doing such a big piece of terrain. So I'm going to do the first coat really watered down, and then yeah, if I still have plenty of Mod Podge, I'll recoat it again. So that's what I'm going to do. Okay, for anyone who is new to my channel, here is my colour palette that I use for my basic rock brushing techniques. First I start with a black Mod Podge coat over the entire project, making sure to get into all the nooks and crannies. Once that is done, I move on to my first level of grey. I use graphite grey to begin with, and with this I don't do dry brushing, but I also do let some of the black show through so it acts like a shadow. Then I move on to neutral grey, value 5, and I dry brush the entire project again. This time I really do have a dry brush, and I make sure to cover the whole project, even the grassy areas, so as not to miss out on any of the rocks and boulders that might be protruding. For the last highlights I add a little titanium white to the neutral grey and really make sure the brush has very little paint on it and do glancing strokes. That's all my grey tones done with highlights and everything. I may come back and do some tan colours and stuff in the rocks, but I want to finish the top first. I want to put all the umbers in, all the greens in, do the flocking, and then I can decide to come back and change the colour of the stone if I want to. Yep, so we're just going to move on to the top of the terrain and do all of that. First on the menu for my earthy tones, I am using raw umber, and this time I will just be painting in all the areas that are going to be either muddy or grassy. Next I'm using the darker sister of raw umber, burnt umber, and for this I am being a bit more patchy. All I am doing is trying to add a little depth and variation, which to be honest doesn't really matter because by the time I have my greens and flocking on you will hardly be able to see it, but I believe that all of these little layers will add some subtle variations to the look of the final piece. I did my first revisit to the rock formations by lightly dry brushing some umber tones over the rocks. For the greens I mixed my own colours using cobalt blue and cadmium yellow. I like the control you have over finding your own green tone. I make sure to paint this green everywhere that I'm going to have grass flocking, and then I move on to my last colour, lime green, for a few highlights just to bring out those subtle variations again. And then it's on to flocking, my favourite bit. With the flocking I watered down my wood glue and I applied it everywhere that I wanted the flocking to stick. As usual, links to all the flocking and foliage products are in the description below the video. One thing that I didn't film is that I also dry brushed some of these green tones onto the rocks to make it look even more earthy and muddy. Okay, so I've got all my grass flocking done, and for now I'm going to be finished with the outside for now, because I am going to come back. I'm going to dust off some of that grass flocking. It's a bit too much, and also I'm going to do maybe a little bit more dry brushing around some of the stonework. I'm going to add some clump foliage and some grass tufts and stuff, and also finish off the tree, dry brushing, etc. But because of time I need to get on with the internal part of the cave, where I am going to do some little pools of epoxy resin here and here. I want there to be 2 little pools and maybe some smaller pools as well. And yeah, whenever I did a build for Shirley Curry with the Skyrim Island, I didn't seal the paint, the acrylic paint, and whenever I poured the epoxy it kind of reactivated the paint and the paint sort of seeped up into the epoxy. I got away with it for that project, but that's not what I want to happen here. So Damien from the Cave of Crafting gave me some advice last night on the Crazy Crafter live stream when we were building these little pieces of terrain. You can go and watch that on the Crazy Crafter live stream. He was saying to put in a clear coat or some varnish underneath before you pour the epoxy. So the only thing that I have is this high gloss varnish, which will do the trick because it'll seal it. It's just going to take a bit of time to cure, in 3 hours. I have to wait before I do that, but Anyway, that's what I'm going to use, only because it's what I've got. I would prefer to have a spray. Anyway, let's get on with it. With this high gloss varnish, I basically paint it into all of the areas that I'm going to pour my epoxy, and yeah, it doesn't really matter if you spill over the edges anywhere, because it's going to have that wet look and it's just going to look like a wet cave. Okay, so I put my varnish into the cave, and yeah, I'm just going to put that to one side while it dries, and I'm going to try and finish off the flocking on the top of this piece. As you can see, this piece is quite green looking, which isn't natural, but it can maybe be quite a fantasy kind of look. For me to improve that, what I need is different colours of flocking. I've just got one colour and I've painted underneath green, and yes, so to do it better, what I would really need is several different colours of flocking, you know, different places, and a static grass applicator would also come in very handy. Anyway, I'm going to do some flocking. I mean foliage. Adding the clump foliage is super straightforward. I use hot glue because the clumps easily cover the glue so that it's not exposed. Then with the little grass tufts, they have this very handy sticky back pad. Again, these tufts are a gift that I got for Christmas, so I had to incorporate them into the project, and as it happens, they do look awesome. As you can see, I also did some dry brushing with a tan colour on my dead tree. Right, time to move on to the epoxy resin phase. I am using a 2-part epoxy. Again, links in the description below if you would like to buy some. This particular brand of epoxy you mix in a 1-to-1 ratio, making sure that both your resin and hardener are exactly the same amount. You have to stir this up really well to make sure that you achieve a good cure and don't end up with tacky resin at the end. The stirring process does introduce air though, and as a result lots of little bubbles, which are quite annoying. Previously I have tried to colour my epoxy resin using acrylic paints and also food colouring, neither of which work very well at all. So I decided to get some epoxy resin pigments, and the colours I chose were Clover Green and Forget Me Not Blue. I then also added some Lime Green. This colouring that I'm doing is all guesswork, and the resulting colour looks kind of like toxic waste, which was not my intention. As you can see, I've got lots of little bubbles in there. I don't know if this is the right way to do it, but I'm going to heat it with a heat gun and hopefully get rid of some of those bubbles. So as you can see, a lot less bubbles. Okay, so the colour's not perfect and there are some tiny little bubbles in there, but I am going to pour my epoxy in anyway. So fingers crossed this goes okay. As I'm watching this footage, I realise that the cave looks like a skull. Skull Cave. It is now Skull Cave. And I should have done more. Oh well. That looks fine. I'm going to have 2 puddles instead of all of these little puddles. But what I was thinking is I want the cave to all look wet anyway. So once this is dry, I am going to go around with my varnish, again clear coat varnish, and I'm going to varnish everything so it just has a wet look in general inside the cave. And in terms of the colour, the colour pretty much turned out for me exactly how I wanted it to be. I'm going to come back in about an hour and hopefully some more of the bubbles have come to the top. I'll give them another little blast with a heat gun. I'm really close to the end of this project now. As you can see, I've added some more flocking here and there. Basically, the more of these little grass tufts I add, I think the better it looks because of the contrast of the colours. But I also want to bring some more contrast into the colours, and for that I have got some lichen, which I picked from the forest myself, and it's all dried out now. I left it on a radiator for a couple of days. Yep, so there's just different kinds of lichen. I'm just going to glue a few pieces in around the place, and yeah, hopefully that will improve it a little bit. There we go guys, that is the end of this week's build. Just before I talk a little bit about the project, I just want to say that today I hit 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. I've actually gone over that, and that is awesome. So thank you so much to everybody who has subscribed to the YouTube channel, everyone who's watched the video, anyone who's left a comment, a like, And yeah, it's just been really encouraging to see the channel grow. I'm actually a bit baffled that that many people appreciate what I do enough to click the subscribe button. So thanks so much, guys. If you're new to the channel, yeah, please help me continue to grow and click that subscribe button and come back and watch other videos. There's some other things that you might appreciate as well. Anyway, on to this. I think this was a great experiment into looking at PIR foam. Maybe you guys have used it before, but it's the first time I've ever really used it, and it was awesome. I didn't like it at first because it's dusty. There are definitely cons to using PIR foam, but there are lots of pros as well. There are things you can do with PIR foam that you cannot do with XPS foam. Super glue, like this texture with the brush, you know, so it's good. I'll definitely use it on terrain again. It won't be my go-to for things like building buildings or bricks because it's quite static and the bricks stick to your hands and all sorts of things. But I will definitely be using it for terrain. Yeah, so that is the end of this week's build. Oh yeah, I also love the fact that I have a super cool cave, and I'm just going to put this over here for 1 second. And during the filming, the voiceover parts, I noticed that it looks like a skull. 2 eyes and the mouth and the head. So this is officially Skull Cave, and that can be incorporated into some D&D games in the future. I can't wait to use this for a game. Anyway guys, I'll see you next time. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and yeah, here's a little montage of this build. Thanks.